It is a privilege for me to be here this morning. In 2010, I completed 47 years in Adventist education and decided it was probably time to retire, starting at 21 years of age and retiring at 68. And since we had a daughter and grandchildren down in this part of the world, we decided to move down here. And we've lived in Raleigh for the last 8 years. Shortly after my retirement, I was contacted by the General Conference if I would be willing to take on a little task for about 6 months, they said. It turned out to be 4 years. But it was to lead out in what our church calls Adventist Heritage Ministry. Now, how many of you have heard of Adventist Heritage Ministry? How many of you have ever visited the Adventist Heritage sites? The William Miller Farm, the Battle Creek Village, Hiram Edson's farm. Not a lot of people have, but approximately 25,000 people a year visit the Adventist heritage sites across North America. So this morning, I'm going to share with you a little bit of what I have done for the last 4 years and have retired again as of last April, but every time I have a chance, I continue to promote Adventist Heritage Ministry. So although this might seem like a bit of a travelogue initially, I really have a lesson I want to share with you. So we'll begin. Adventist Heritage Ministry. It's part of the Ellen G. White estate. The ministry is owned and operated by the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. AHM has offices located in Silver Spring, Maryland, and a smaller office in Battle Creek, Michigan. From there, the North American division operates the Adventist Heritage Ministry. It has a full-time director who has taken my place in Washington, D.C., for which I'm very thankful, and I can again retire and relax somewhat. Adventist Heritage Ministry says it is a past with a future. Why do we come here on Saturday? Have you ever asked yourself the question, why do I come here on Saturday? Is it because we need a place to go on Sabbath? Is it because our children are in church school? Is it because our children enjoy the Pathfinder Club? Do we come here to hear the pastor because we enjoy his preaching? Just to be social, to meet friends? Is it to participate in music? Perhaps it's all of the above and some things I haven't mentioned. But most of all, I believe we come here every Sabbath because we believe Jesus is coming again. And Adventist Heritage Ministry is dedicated to the proposal that we cannot forget that Jesus is coming again. Time goes on, we're told he's coming soon. My grandmother told me Jesus was coming soon. My mother told me Jesus was coming soon. I told my children that Jesus is coming soon. And for 47 years, I told Adventist students in Adventist schools Jesus was coming soon. I'm now 76 years of age. And Jesus is still coming soon. I believe that with all my heart. We are told We have nothing to fear for the future, except we forget how God has led us in the past. Winston Churchill said something like this when he said, "A nation that forgets its past has no future." The same is true. We have nothing to fear except we forget. So I ask you the question this morning, is it possible? Is it possible that we could forget? This book is filled with stories of people who forgot. People who forgot. Is it possible that we could forget? In Battle Creek, Michigan, we have the historic Adventist village. This Seventh-day Adventist church was founded and began in the city of Battle Creek, Michigan. In the middle of that village is this house owned by Ellen and James White, where they lived for many years and raised their children. 35 years ago, this house was unoccupied, totally in disarray, crumbling, falling down, and was scheduled to be removed from the face of the earth. A number of Adventist laymen and interested people got together and raised some money and rebuilt the home of Ellen White. And thus began what we call Adventist Heritage Ministry. In time, the denomination, the General Conference, has taken it over. And today, around the globe, there are more than 20 Adventist heritage sites where people come and visit the first publishing house, the first church, the college, so on. It's a beautiful little house. There's no electricity or running water. There wasn't back in the time when James and Ellen White lived in it. But it's open, it can be toured. One of the interesting things I like to share with people when they tour that house, and I particularly remind my wife when we go into our walk-in closet and see two long rows of hangers for hanging clothes. How much clothes closet space do you think Ellen and James White had in their bedroom? 4 hooks and a rod that does not measure 18 inches long. Their entire wardrobes hung in there. Very simple people, but dedicated, committed to this Adventist denomination. In the village, we have this building just behind Ellen and James White House called the Second Meeting House. This is where they went to church. It's called the Second Meeting House because the first meeting house burned down and it was rebuilt. So they always referred to it as the Second Meeting House. And church is held in here many Sabbaths during the calendar year. People meet there, churches come and hold services there. In that Battle Creek village, there was also the Review and Herald Publishing House. As you recall from Adventist history, it burned down. And recently, they have rebuilt a replica to the size and the blueprints of the original Review and Herald Publishing House. That's the building. It was newly constructed when this picture was taken. It has since been landscaped and looks much better than this picture I have here. Around the village are other small homes that Ellen White's sons lived in and others. And we have this log cabin. This log cabin is of particular significance to Adventists because during the early 1840s, a man over in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, by the name of Joseph Bates, who was a sea captain, and I'll tell you something about him a little bit later, was studying as he was sailing around the world, and he found Christ and Christianity, and he educated himself into the belief of the seventh-day Sabbath. When he returned from one of his last voyages, he came off the ship, and as he was walking down the bridge towards his home there in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, somebody said to him, "What's the news, Captain Bates?" And he said, "The news is the seventh day is the Sabbath, and we should all keep it." Joseph Bates later got out of shipping and being a ship's captain and became an itinerant preacher, self-supported, and he traveled up and down the East Coast and into Canada, preaching the seventh day is the Sabbath. He heard of this group in Battle Creek, Michigan, this leftover group of disappointed people who had gone through the great disappointment of 1844 with William Miller. And Joseph Bates traveled from Fairhaven, Massachusetts, across to Battle Creek, Michigan. He knew no one in Battle Creek, Michigan. They did not know he was coming. He went to the postmaster, and he said to the postmaster, "Who is the most honest man in town?" And the postmaster said, "The man who lives in the log cabin, his name is David Hewitt." Bates went over and knocked on his door and said, "I have a message for you from the Lord." And Joseph Bates studied with David Hewitt all through the night, and by early morning, David Hewitt became a Sabbath keeper. And that's how the Sabbath came into Battle Creek and the early believers and those left over from the 1844 disappointment. And from there on, those who met in the first and second meeting houses started keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. We come to the William Miller home. This home is located in Whitehall, New York, close to the Vermont border. Small little town, but William Miller was a Baptist preacher. He was a justice of the peace. He had been a colonel in the army, quite an educated and prominent man. He lived in this house. He owned the farm there. These are the barns that he kept his horses and dairy cows in. And out behind the barn is this outcropping of rock, which has become known as Ascension Rock. It was on October 22, 1844, that William Miller had gathered his flock of followers out there on that rock, waiting for Jesus to come. And he didn't come. And the group kind of fell apart, but many of them stayed with the belief that Jesus is coming again. They were a group of Baptists, some with Methodist background or other backgrounds. Some gave up completely, totally disappointed and just left. No one knows what happened to them. Oh, too much button here. William Miller built this little chapel on his farm. He was a couple of years after the disappointment of 1844. He was put out of the Baptist church. His preaching credentials were taken from him, but a number of people stayed with him, and he continued to preach that Jesus was coming again. And the group that followed William Miller never became Seventh-day Adventists, but are known today as the Advent Christians. Out here on Highway 42, just before you get to Cornwallis Road, is an Advent Christian church, probably the size of this one, or maybe a little larger. But William Miller's followers became known as the Advent Christians. This is the boyhood home of William Miller. He was born and raised in this house. It was completely fallen down and just caved in. And somebody who took a great deal of interest in William Miller decided that his boyhood home should be rebuilt, and raised and donated from his own pocket some $400,000 to buy this property and rebuild the William Miller boyhood home. It is now occupied by the family that takes care of the William Miller farm and gives the tours there and takes care of the maintenance and so on. Another picture of the boyhood home of William Miller. At the same time William Miller was preaching Jesus is coming again, prior to October 22, 1844, there was another man by the name of Hiram Edson who held the same belief. He lived over near Rochester, New York. This is not his home, but one that was created to resemble his home. A heritage ministry purchased the small 17-acre farm that was left from Hiram Edson's property. And the barn you see in the background was actually a barn that was located on the property of some of the relatives of Hiram Edson and was disassembled, moved to this location, and reassembled again. The only nails in that barn are the ones that hold the siding on. The entire post and beam structure of that barn is drilled out, and large dowels are pounded through the holes to tie it together. There's no nails or bolts in the entire framework of that barn. It's quite a structure inside. We call Hiram Edson's farm the birthplace of Adventist theology because in 1846, just 2 years after his disappointment, and he too had a group of people on his farm believing and preaching that Jesus was coming again in 1844, he wrote the doctrines we adhere to today: the Sabbath, the sanctuary, the state of the dead, the second coming of Jesus, and the spirit of prophecy. Now, we as Adventists mostly think that the 1844 disappointment was something that happened with William Miller and Hiram Edson and perhaps some other people. There was, in fact, from 1840 to 1844, some 400 or more preachers around the world, in Europe, across America, so on, all preaching 1844 message. Jesus was coming again. They had all come to the same belief. But we are connected to these two particular men because it's the people who followed them and were tied to them who became the first Seventh-day Adventists. Behind the barn there at the Hiram Edson farm is this prophecy trail that goes out a half a mile into the woods. And you see these little stations. They have a bench, a plaque there, with each of the 12 basic prophecies that we believe in as a Seventh-day Adventist church. And one can read about them and sit there and talk about them or just think and pray. But there's 12 of these stations that go back on this trail through the woods. The barn that's located on the Edson property is a gathering place. People come there almost every weekend through the summer months, there's some kind of a church service or a potluck or wedding. There's been weddings there at the barn. It's quite a structure and an interesting place, and people meet there on a regular basis through the summer months. It's a rather cold place in the winter, and it's pretty much closed up from November through April or May. This is the home of Joseph Bates. He was a sea captain, as I said. This picture shows the home as it was purchased about 12 years ago. It is the oldest the oldest continuously occupied home in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. The original part of the home was built in 1742. And someone has lived in that home ever since 1742 continuously. Well, it's nothing like the home Joseph Bates lived in as a young boy growing up, and even as he lived in as a sea captain. That front porch was all added. And this shows the house as it's being remodeled and under reconstruction. It looks like this today, except the lawn is all in this summer, and some other refinements have been made. If you see a line running from top to bottom, left of the door, everything from that line to your right is the house that Joseph Bates lived in as a boy growing up. It was decided that we would keep the additions because what's being created there is a museum regarding the Seventh-day Sabbath and the life of Joseph Bates. As people come through the museum, they will be introduced to Joseph Bates, who's a historical figure in that community. His dad was a minister in the community for years. His father built an academy in Fairhaven, Massachusetts in the early years. And so the name of Bates is well known in the Fairhaven community. And as people visit this property, they will get information from us regarding the Seventh-day Sabbath and the life of Joseph Bates and some history on the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I come back to this question I posed earlier. Is it possible for us to forget? It's an interesting question to ask ourselves and ponder. I want to share with you a story. A few years ago, the director of Adventist Heritage Ministry, Dr. Jim Nix, took a group of church school students, 7th and 8th graders, on a spring trip, a historical tour of early Adventism here in North America. And they visited these sites I have just shared with you. They ended up on Friday night on Ascension Rock, out there behind the William Miller barn. And there they had Vespers, and Elder Nick shared with them some historical facts about the Adventist Church and some stories about some of the interesting people and characters who started this denomination and this church of ours. When he was finished, he said, "Let us gather in a circle, join hands, and sing. Lift up the trumpet, loud let it ring, Jesus is coming again." And those young people looked at Elder Nix and they said, "We don't know that song. We don't know that song." And Elder Nix said to them, "I understand, that's a song from my generation. That's a song from my generation. Teach me one of your songs about Jesus is coming again. These new choruses that you sing, Teach me one about Jesus is coming again. And then these young people from a good Adventist church school looked at each other and talked back and forth, this song, this chorus, this chorus. And they came to the conclusion that they did not have a song about Jesus is coming again. So that night on Ascension Rock, that group of young people were taught the song, Jesus is coming again. I ask you, is it possible we could forget? Is it possible? Let us stand and sing. Lift up the trumpet. Loud let it ring.